hi all. Thank you for joining the Washington College of Law's International Trade and Investment Law Society tonight for this event on empowering women through international trade agreements during March, which of course is International Women's History Month. We're so lucky to have some of the best speakers here from far and wide to discuss these issues relating to gender and trade, which have always been important and I think are starting to be addressed more internationally. So moderating this discussion, we're lucky to have Renata Amaral. Renata is the founder of the Women Inside Trade Association, a networking group that focuses on influencing and strengthening the international trade community, as well as providing visibility to the work of women on international trade. She is currently a senior consultant, a scholar in residence, and adjunct professor at the Trade Investment and Development Program of the Washington College of Law, a guest lecturer in postgraduate courses in international trade and business in Brazil, and the vice chair of ABCI Institute based in Washington, D.C. On the panel, we have Desiree LeClercq, who is the Proskauer Employment and Labor Law Assistant Professor at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Prior to joining the ILR school, she was the Director for Labor Affairs at USTR, where she negotiated and enforced labor rights commitments in U.S. trade agreements. In that capacity, Ms. LeClercq frequently was involved in several U.S. interagency task forces on forced labor, gender rights, and capacity building. Prior to joining USTR in 2016, Ms. LeClercq was a legal officer for the ILO in Geneva, Switzerland, where she specialized in maritime labor law and trade agreements. Dr. Amrita Bahri is currently an assistant professor of international trade law at ITAM University and co-chair professor for the WTO Chair Program of Mexico. Amrita is the founding professor of the International Trade and Investment Law Research Group and the founding member of the South Asian International Economic Law Network. She has been published in the areas of international trade law, WTO dispute settlement, public-private partnership for capacity building in emerging economies, regional trade, and gender justice. She has authored the monograph Public-Private Partnership for WTO dispute settlement, enabling developing countries and working with ITCs. With the ITC team, Amrita designated the very first framework to measure gender responsiveness of free trade agreements. Finally, we have Ms. Georgina Wainwright-Kemdirim, who is a senior official at Global Affairs Canada in Ottawa, Canada. She serves as the lead negotiator of Canada's inclusive trade chapters in trade agreements, including trade and gender, and leads the implementation of those in-force chapters. She was Canada's lead negotiator for the new Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, recently signed by Canada and its Inclusive Trade Action Group partners, New Zealand and Chile. She is also Canada's gender focal point for trade policy and negotiations and developed Canada's new approach for applying a comprehensive gender-based analysis plus approach to trade negotiations and final agreements, including USMCA, which I'm sure we'll hear more from her about. So thank you all panelists and Renata again for joining us this evening. I'm very excited about this discussion, and for attendees, please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat as they come up. So with that, I'll hand the microphone over to Renata. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you, Poppy. I'm delighted to host actually friends of mine and people that I really admire to speak about gender and trade. I think those three speakers are the most qualified, or among at least the most qualified in the field. So it's a privilege to have all of you here with us this afternoon. So I'll start with a simple question to all of you, Desiree, Amrita, and Georgina. Is it important to include gender provisions in international trade agreements? And does trade affect women differently than men? Desiree, would you like to start?
Sure, and I just want to give a quick word of thanks to Renata and the Center for inviting me here to speak to you all. I think that this is a really important topic. I think that those of us who are on this panel would likely agree that trade does affect men and women very differently, and it is for that reason that we should be discussing gender provisions in trade in the first place. With that being said, I think the latter part of your question is probably very easy for us, and it's the former part that is probably worth the most consideration, and that is, are gender provisions important to include in trade agreements? I think that a separate question exists concerning whether we think that is important, and I think this is based on the research I've been doing on this question with respect to U.S. trade policy, the results of which are coming out in an article this fall in Fordham Law Review. The short answer is we cannot answer your question about gender provisions unless we first answer two interrelated questions. First, we have to identify the objective of gender provisions in trade agreements. That is, why would a country like the United States regulate gender provisions? Would it do so to protect American workers and businesses in the trade relationship, something that Ambassador Tai has recently echoed as a critical trade priority for the United States? Or would it do so to protect the women in the trade partner countries? Those are not necessarily the same answer. Second, when we refer to gender provisions, what exactly are we referring to? Many would answer that we're referring to prohibitions against gender discrimination. However, that provision's already in there. Under the labor chapters in the US, the EU, CPTPP, Chile, and a host of other FTAs and RTAs, trade partners already require adherence to the ILO's 4 fundamental labor rights. One of those labor rights is the prohibition against discrimination based on sex in the employment relationship. The standard includes ensuring that equal pay is provided for equal work. So if we're not talking about eliminating gender discrimination, what are we talking about? We must be asking for something more than anti-discrimination. In my article, I attempt to synthesize all of the trade proposals coming out of the gender working groups in the WTO, the World Bank, the UN, the OECD. I group the arguments in favor of gender provisions along 5 broad policy objectives, all of which point to protecting women in trade partner countries, and none of which point to protecting women in the United States or other developed countries that would presumably pen those provisions. The real issue, however, concerned the second question. None of those groups seem to agree on the legal standard that would make up the gender provision. In fact, few even tried. Despite the absence of a legal standard, many advocates still argue that those provisions, whatever they may be, should be subject to dispute settlement and sanctions. But without a concrete legal standard, is it possible to adjudicate the efficacy or desirability of a gender provision in trade agreements? For instance, I see calls all the time for mainstreaming gender through a quote unquote gender lens. That's great in the hortatory sense, but it means absolutely nothing in the legal sense. When I was a trade negotiator at USTR, had I been before a dispute panel accused of failing to negotiate through a gender lens, my defense would have consisted of 4 words. Ain't I a woman? I suspect that the failure for the gender movement to coalesce around a uniform legal standards reflects discomfort. But it's premature to have a sophisticated conversation concerning these provisions unless and until we can all recover from our discomfort. We have to be able to say 2 things with a straight face. First, we have to demonstrate how the current gender paradigm lowers costs of productions in countries to the detriment of trade competition. That argument's uncomfortable because it requires us to argue that by implementing affirmative gender policies, companies will increase the cost of their production. I don't think people are willing to admit that yet, but until they do, countries like the United States will not be persuaded that their trade agreements should include binding gender provisions. Second, we have to land on a succinct legal standard. We have to become comfortable with defining the affirmative obligations that we would impose on trade partner countries. We have to do more than use terms like gender lens and mainstreaming if we're going to come up with predictable provisions in order to put in these trade agreements. So that's my very long-winded answer to not really answer your question. Thanks, Renata.
I really liked it, and I think it's good because you set a standard to be very provocative, and I know Amrita might have a different perspective to share with us on those questions. Amrita?
Yeah, well, I would certainly have a slightly different perspective, but I have to say that I completely agree with what Desiree has said here. Because first of all, I agree with Desiree that yes, the answer is a big yes to both the questions. It is important to include gender provisions, and trade affects women and men differently. And We have seen that in numbers. We have seen that in studies and reports and research so many times, multiple times, right? Now, when we look at trade agreements right now as they exist, we realize that trade agreements have shown a very impressive accommodation of sustainable development goals, right? About 75% of FTAs today include provisions on human rights. More than half, I would say more than 60% include commitments on labor rights protection, right? And just over about 22% have an explicit commitment on gender equality. So most of the labor rights protection commitments that are included in the trade agreement so far are not gender explicit, so to say, right? So what does this mean? Does this mean that all existing trade agreements have a positive impact or a positive correlation with sustainable development, including gender equality? The answer is no. The relationship between trade and sustainable development is not always positive. And studies, for instance, have shown that trade agreements may further increase existing gender inequalities. They can put livelihoods and employment of women at risk. Trade liberalization can disrupt economic activities where women are most active, and hence deprive them of employment and business opportunities. Agreements can increase gender wage gap that we see today and we have to deal with today, and create poorer conditions for women in developing countries. Due to trade liberalization, female workers and producers are more likely to contribute to unskilled labor force in export-oriented markets and industries, and remain pretty much concentrated in low-skilled activities with a little chance to access high value-added and jobs that so far remain dominated by males, right? And this phenomena, as we understand, is known as the feminization of labor, which refers to both an increase in female employment, but mostly in the labor-intensive, low-value-added, low-wage rate activities that amounts to worsening the conditions of female workforce, mainly in developing countries. But then if you look at the other hand, we have studies that have shown how trade agreements, how trade policy instruments, if they are negotiated with a gender lens, even though they don't include binding, enforceable legal commitments, as Desiree has mentioned a while ago, if they're negotiated with a gender lens, let's talk about what negotiation with a gender lens means in a second. They can translate to more job opportunities. They can translate to better business connections. They can translate to enhanced market access and fewer barriers to access finance and other productive resources for women in trade. So scholarship is clearly divided on how trade agreements impact and interact with gender equality. And we perhaps need more sex disaggregated data to better understand this nexus and the impact trade agreements have on men and women in different sectors of different countries and regions. But in the meantime, it is crucial, it is fundamental to promote gender mainstreaming in trade agreements, to ensure that these agreements do not increase the existing inequalities. And that brings me to the fundamental question as to what is gender mainstreaming? Well, in FTA's context, it means the inclusion of gender equality considerations in the drafting and implementation of FTAs. Its aim is to maximize the positive impact and minimize the negative impact these agreements might have on women's situations and on women empowerment. And this has been, and this can be done in various ways. And I'm sure Georgina would have concrete examples to share with us in this respect.
Georgina, would you like to jump in?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. Well, I guess we all agree that yes is the answer to those first two questions. And, you know, Canada has been pursuing gender provisions in trade agreements now since 2017. You know, I just want to note that, you know, 25 years ago, including environment and labor chapters in trade agreements was new. So, you know, we have to start somewhere with these gender chapters or these gender provisions. But, you know, labor and environment chapters are standard now, and I think going forward, gender chapters and gender provisions across other chapters is going to become standard. When we encounter resistance from our trade negotiating partners, we always try to show them that, you know, trade is not gender neutral given the particular barriers faced by women, and our trade and gender chapters seek to address those barriers with cooperation activities. And certainly, you know, these are soft law, you might say. But, we have to start somewhere, and over time, some of the contents in these trade and gender chapters will become, stronger, harder disciplined, and hopefully enforceable chapters as well. We also consider that there is important economic value in addressing gender issues in trade agreements. We're seeking gender provisions across our entire agreements, and if they benefit Canadian women as well as the women of other of our negotiating partners, we're fine with that. We see opportunities, to seek hard gender responsive provisions in such as on non-discrimination on the basis of certification of professions in the services chapter, for example. We're trying to get women on dispute settlement panels in the dispute settlement chapter. In the investment chapter, we want to see women in the senior management and board of directors, and allowing for that in the investment chapter. In the government procurement chapter, we're seeking provisions, that allows for special consideration to women-owned businesses in government procurement. We're also seeking a non-derogation clause in the trade and gender chapter now. Our trade and gender chapter has come a long way since 2017, and that non-derogation provision, for example, seeks to ensure that countries do not lower their gender equality laws in order to attract trade and investment. So we are also finding opportunities to bring gender responsive provisions into the technical barriers to trade chapter, in the sanitary and phytosanitary measures chapter, and a whole host of other chapters. Our trade agreements are very comprehensive and deep now, with a range of different chapters that, for example, such as on intellectual property even. There's all these opportunities, and we are applying this gender lens to sort of look for these and build up our knowledge about how to, bring some discipline and to these provisions across our trade agreement. I had some set notes that I was going to convey during this conversation. I don't think I'm going to really pursue them, but I think from Canada's point of view, gender provisions are really important in trade agreements. We know that women do not, share in the benefits of trade as much as they should. In the case of Canada, women account for only 16% of SMEs, and only 15% of those are exporters. There's a lot of challenges out there, but we want to ensure that women contribute to our economy and benefit from our trade agreements. So that's sort of where we're at in Canada, and I can certainly tell you more as the conversation proceeds. But I think it's safe to say that I think gender provisions are here to stay, and we do have to start to move them beyond cooperation-based soft law and move it to harder disciplines. But we have to have a willing trade partner on the other side. And to do that, we have to show that it's of benefit to them economically and socially, and that's what we're trying to do on Canada's side. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Georgina. So, Amrita, I would like to go back to you and maybe to provide a little bit of context to the ones that are joining us today on the work of international organizations. I know you are the author of a recent ITC report on trade and gender. So, reflecting a little bit about the trade and women's agenda at the WTO, and bearing in mind the work of the World Bank, the ITC itself, and other international organizations on the forefront of trade policy, what can we say has been achieved so far? And please, Desiree and Georgina, if you want to comment after Amrita's answer, please feel free to interact. Okay, Amrita.
Thank you so much, Renata, for the wonderful question. I would say a lot has been achieved, and a lot of activities have happened in the last few years. Especially in particular, the last 5 years have been phenomenal in this respect. Let me first talk about a few developments that have taken place at WTO multilaterally, and then look at the bilateral or the regional negotiation context. So at the WTO, what have we seen in the last few years? One, WTO now has a web page which is dedicated to women in trade. Two, multilateral development includes the joint declaration that almost 70% of WTO members had signed on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment in 2017. And this declaration pretty much reinforces the importance of enhancing women's access to economic opportunities using international trade policy instruments. Right after signing this, WTO nominated a specialized trade and gender focal point. And this focal point is now responsible for handling the trade and gender related issues multilaterally in the multilateral context. And the other developments could include, let's say, most recently, I guess it was last year in September, when a group of WTO members got together and they established an informal working group on trade and gender. And that's quite impressive. We have also seen a number of studies and outreach activities on trade and gender at the WTO. However, let's be realistic here. Not a single provision, not a single agreement, be it multilateral or plurilateral, or not even a single WTO dispute settlement or appellate body report for that matter, makes an explicit mention of any expression that is related to gender equality. So in that sense, literally speaking, WTO law or WTO agreements or the primary sources of WTO law are completely gender blind, if you look at the face value, right? In that respect, bilateral or regional negotiations have probably taken the lead. 6 countries have signed trade agreements with a standalone chapter on trade and gender. European Parliament in 2018 passed a resolution to include gender equality considerations in all its future trade agreements, right? EU and Canada has adopted a recommendation as a complementary document to its agreement, CETA, by the name of Trade and Gender Recommendation, wherein parties recognize the importance of making trade policies more gender responsive. In 2020, well, last year, Canada, Chile, and New Zealand signed a global trade and gender agreement together that Georgina has mentioned. That's another great development. Shows us that when parties, should not say forget, but when parties realize that they need to do more about gender equality commitments, that they haven't already accommodated sufficient gender equality considerations in their main agreements text, then they still have the option of negotiating and attaching to the main agreement various gender equality cooperation commitments or legally binding commitments by way of these supplementary documents, right? And I would also like to bring your attention to various existing trade agreements where parties have committed to reducing barriers relating to restricted access to finance, increasing access to health services, increasing access to education for women, increasing access to digital know-how, and reducing violence and discrimination based on sex. There are a number of agreements that come to my mind, but of course, you know, we have paucity of time to sort of go over. But some of them, for instance, Canada, Chile is a leading example of how FTAs can include commitments on increasing women's access to education, skill development. Parties in this agreement create encouraging conditions for women businesses. And if such commitments, such promises are put to action, well, they might be able to help women businesses in the post-pandemic economic recovery to recover and come back on the market. But of course, the fundamental problem here is the enforceability of these provisions. Going back to the point Desiree made right at the outset, what is the purpose of having or mainstreaming gender if you don't have concrete commitments that are either legally enforceable or are subject to dispute settlement, or if there is no identification of how these provisions or commitments might be enforced or implemented or put to action by the parties. And this can only be done if the parties have the political willingness and the capacity as well as the motivation to assume these commitments. And there are various triggering factors, and I'm sure we will probably listen to some of these triggering factors of what triggers this political motivation. Canada, for instance, is, in my opinion, a real champion of change because it has included these advanced gender responsive commitments in its trade agreements. But perhaps the question for us is gender mainstreaming by way of including these cooperation-based provisions of any use? To me, the answer clearly is yes. Even though they are not enforceable, And even though they cannot or they do not have the capacity to be implemented at the moment, even though countries do not intend to implement them, if they include them in their agreements, for example, Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement subjects their trade and gender commitments and the trade and gender chapter to the dispute settlement mechanism of the agreement. But then the jurisdiction of this dispute settlement mechanism is binding but not compulsory. So that leaves me with the with a big issue and a big gray hole that, well, why has it subjected these provisions to dispute settlement if the jurisdiction is not compulsory? It doesn't make any sense. But probably it does, because these kind of provisions are based on the spirit of cooperation, unless and until we get to the stage where we have sufficient understanding and capacity to understand the nexus, the relationship between trade and gender.
Excellent. Desiree?
So if I could go back to the question I think that you asked, which was the work of international organizations and trade policy. One of the things that I would highlight that I think often gets left out of the gender discussion is the work of the ILO. So I know, we had mentioned already that labor provisions do touch on gender issues, but the ILO is actually doing direct work on gender issues. And in fact, one thing that, people don't always follow the work of other international organizations, but in 2019, the ILO passed the Convention Against Violence and Harassment. And in that convention, the ILO provides a definition for gender-based violence and harassment. And this, oftentimes we talk about gender-based violence, but there have been very few leading efforts to really define the contours of that. And the ILO has now provided an international definition for that. And for those of us working in this policy space, one of the big issues confronting women and, even the non-binary is gender-based violence and harassment. That is something that impacts the trade relationship. So to the extent that the ILO is working on this area, I just draw that to everyone's attention. Another point that Amrita raised that I think is interesting, kind of implicitly, she mentioned it would be helpful if these international organizations would do more. And I completely agree with her there. I think that to the extent that in partnership, the organizations wanted to provide the definitions and the legal standards that are lacking from the discourse. FYI, I noticed still nobody's defined what a gender lens means in any kind of measurable way. To the extent that international organizations on a neutral platform can provide these definitions, can provide these standards, they will be pushing this momentum far more than a trade agreement between two parties is, because that's the parties' economic agreement between each other. It has nothing to do with an international standard. And Georgina, going to your point, you made an excellent point about how labor and environment were really the early models, and they've come forward. And now we see how 90% of trade agreements involve these sustainability provisions. They started somewhere, they started in the NALC where there was no international standard. And the big complaint then was that the standards didn't make any sense and they weren't implementable in practice. And you couldn't really have a good dispute because of the way that it was crafted and managed. Look now, the ILO has provided concrete instruments that can be incorporated by reference into trade agreements. It's not a perfect system. There's still plenty of flaws that I hope we don't reproduce in the gender context. But nevertheless, drawing from that experience, we could say, well, it would be really nice if an international organization would take the reins here, would provide a neutral standard here, would define gender lens for people, for example. And then trade agreements wouldn't be reinventing the wheel. They would be incorporating by reference something that had been agreed upon in a neutral platform, absent the power plays of trade negotiations. And I think that would get us a lot further.
Comments. I think, Georgina, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, yeah, no, I really agree everything that Desiree said there. And, it's very possible this global trade and gender arrangement that we have signed with Chile and New Zealand might form the basis of something that can go global. I admittedly, it is a cooperation-based instrument right now, but it brings gender provisions that are appearing other chapters in a traditional trade agreement into this arrangement, as well as the cooperation activities. And it is a process of learning as we go, and it's an iterative process. But I think it will add value over time. This arrangement is open for other countries to join, and we'll see what's possible at the WTO. Amrita did talk about the informal working group being established. under the Buenos Aires Declaration there in September. A work plan that Canada developed was endorsed by the WTO members in February. So now we're beginning to implement that work plan. And one of the pillars of the work plan is gender lens and defining that gender lens and then bringing it forward to all of the work across the WTO. So anyways, we're working on that. I think Canada has a very good, successful practice now when we're applying a gender-based analysis to trade agreements. We are going to bring our experience and knowledge that we've gained over the last almost 3 years in this work to the WTO work, working with our like-mindeds, particularly the European Union on this. So I think it will bear fruit, but a multilateral approach is very different from a bilateral approach for sure. But just back to another point you made, I can't remember now. I think it might have been Amrita who said it. There is no multilateral agreement at the WTO that brings a gender lens. That is true, but Canada has been trying at the Domestic Regulations Joint Statement Initiative, the Plurilateral Initiative at the WTO, to bring a gender provision forward, similar to what is appearing in our services chapters, to ensure that there's non-discrimination on the basis of gender for certifications in the professional services sector. So, we keep pushing, we're making our rationale, we're hoping we can bring something like this forward in the JSI for MC12 later this year. So wish us luck. We need all of the WTO members to join us in this effort. Now, just back to one other thing that Amrita mentioned about our Israel, the application of dispute settlement to the Trade and Gender chapter with Israel. It's true, it's very unique. We got a lot of flack from stakeholders when we signed our Trade and Gender chapter with Chile, and the DS of the trade agreement did not apply. So, you're right. I don't think it needs to apply. This is a cooperation-based chapter, but we were responding to stakeholders who thought, oh, this is fluff. No one will take this chapter seriously. You have to have dispute settlement apply. So this is why we came up with this very unique and odd approach that we have with Chile, but it's really quite to satisfy our, our stakeholders and our negotiating partner as well. This is new, and we're all, as I said before, learning as we go. But I think with a like-minded partner who's very progressive and inclusive in their trade policy, we might get there with a very strong enforceable chapter someday. I hope we can get there. I think Canada would be ready for something like that. So yeah, we take our chapters seriously. We take our provisions in other chapters seriously. It's not fluff. We're committed, and we are gaining a lot of experience now implementing our trade and gender chapters. We've got 10 activities delivered with Chile and more than 20 with the European Union. So we're seeing value added and real fruit. Real fruit is being born through these, I think.
Excellent comments. I think we need 2 more hours actually for this webinar, because I have so many follow-up questions coming to my mind and I cannot make them. But one thing that Amrita was very assertive about is about the blindness of the WTO rules. And I completely agree, although we see the Secretariat frequently reaffirming that the rules are neutral, and that's something complicated, because if they don't at least reflect on the rules as being maybe a little bit blind, it's hard to to push the movement for the governments actually, and to create the momentum that Desiree just mentioned, to create something different. So Georgina, I think I would like actually to continue with you, because Canada, and we all know that Canada is pushing for gender chapters and gender provisions, and has been the pioneer in reality on this movement multilaterally also. So can you share with us briefly, like what are the primary tools, provisions that can be included in international agreements or in the enforcement of trade agreements to best address gender disparities in trade and benefit women. And actually, I have one question for you since you are here, and I would like to take advantage of this. I have concerns if I know the value of gender chapters in trade agreements. But honestly, part of me believes that they don't work for every country. It depends a lot on the level of acknowledgement that the government has on gender and on gender stuff in general. For example, I'm going to give a very concrete example. We have a Mercosur-Canada agreement. Mm-hmm. And Canada asked for a gender chapter, mm-hmm. Right? Right. I have to say, I don't really believe that Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay have honestly the tools, and they have gone deep, for example, in gender provision. What do they mean itself? You know, they agreed to the chapter because Canada asked for the chapter. So that's something that concerns me. To what extent the Canada model can be translated to other countries with different levels of development, mm-hmm. with different, different progress in terms of gender. I think it's very complicated and something that always strikes me. So, please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, those are really good questions. So whenever you're pursuing provisions like this that are new, they can be scary, for countries who are at different levels of development. And we recognize that, different countries are at different levels of ambition, knowledge, skills. And I think that's the value of the Trade and Gender chapter is that, being cooperation based. I always like to say it's low risk, high reward, because we're talking about cooperation. We can set up video conferences and talk about, well, what are Canada's gender equality laws and what programs do we have in place to support women's economic environment, women's economic empowerment and participation in trade. And we've got a lot of new, a lot of stories we can tell. And, our Business Women in International Trade program started with a young officer at our embassy in Washington over 20 years ago. And this has grown into a really long sustained program supporting women's participation, women business owners' participation in trade. But, I think when you talk about taking into consideration different levels of development, one thing that we have come to realize as well is that our inclusive trade chapters, including our trade and gender chapter, does have development dividends for developing countries. It's about raising awareness, raising knowledge and skills, showing them like the governance structures that need to be in place so women can participate in the economy. Trade policies and domestic policies are connected. They have to be coherent. They have to be, relevant to each other. And participating in the economy, a natural part of that continuum is participation in trade. So all of this is connected. And, we are trying to show, that there is this trade and development nexus in our inclusive trade chapters, and the development dividends are real if our partner country can be open to them. I see what you're saying. I mean, I negotiated that trade and gender chapter with Mercosur. And, it always takes a little bit time to get going, but once you can show them the value to them, it was a very positive experience. And they also brought some progressive ideas to the table. And I can't wait to start to implement that chapter. But, the trade agreement, we haven't had around now in quite some time. And it would be great to have Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay join our global trade and gender arrangement, because we can get to work like right away on something like that. Now, let me just see. I'm just trying to see, did I answer all your questions? Because I know I had some notes I wanted to convey, but I feel like we're going in so many different directions than I was originally thinking we would. So is that a good enough response for now, or is there something more you had hoped I would talk about?
No, I think you answered. And I have to say that as a Brazilian, I really hope that we implement fully the mainstreaming gender connection. So Desiree, you wanted to make a comment?
So one thing I just wanted to highlight is, I completely agree with Canada's approach up to now and everything that Georgina just said about the positive prospects of development resources, of the technical assistance that's provided in gender chapters. I mean, we didn't really, Amrita did to some extent, but we really didn't discuss too much on the origins or the root of the illness that allows men to so much, to advantage from trade so much more than women do. But quite frequently, what the data shows is that it's resource related, that particularly in developing countries, the way that the labor markets are structured, access to technology and resources, access to education, things of that nature really create this structural paradigm that leads to some of these inequalities. So if you think about that as the problem, then the solution is to provide the types of resources, the type of knowledge that will enable the types of policies that can redress that. That's all fine. The issue becomes when we start talking about creating a sanctioning mechanism for noncompliance with these provisions. So in other words, to take what right now I think is an effective labor or gender provision and make it subject to disputes settlement and to sanctions, because then what happens? Well, we're going to be taking resources away from a country where the root of the ill is that of lack of resources. And we've only begun to start to understand what happens with sanctions under the labor provisions. We still don't have a lot of information, but early indications suggest that employers that are not benefiting from trade end up closing and therefore displacing the workers that we were trying to protect. I would want a lot more information about the distributional effects of sanctions before I could draw any kinds of normative conclusions on whether or not we should do something similar on gender. So I'm sure, Renata, you can think about it in the Brazil framework or any of these other developing country frameworks. Should we be discussing imposing these types of policies on governments with the threat of sanction? I'm all for the dissuasive effect of sanctions, but I think that the harms might outweigh the benefits there. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, excellent. Amrita, would you like to make a comment?
Just really quick response to what Desiree mentioned here. We have seen very strict, perhaps the most stringent labor right protection commitments being included in USMCA, and mostly being targeted to the Mexican market. Mexico is a developing country. It doesn't seem to have the capacity to comply with those commitments, but the commitments are completely enforceable. They're highly enforceable. So, there again is a capacity gap there and a capacity issue. But when it came to labor, as I guess you've rightly argued in one of your recent pieces, when there is a market argument or when there is a market logic behind coming up with the enforceable provisions, then of course, these social or non-trade, non-market issues can become enforceable, as we have seen in the USMCA's case, but not in others. And we've also seen how general exceptions, for example, Article 20A of GATT 94, public morality, has allowed different countries to protect various non-economic, non-market social values. So the question is, if we can protect turtles, sea turtles or dolphins or plants or animals using this general exception or using enforceable commitments or exceptions which are escape windows to violate the trade obligations under WTO, I don't really understand the hesitation to come up with the legally enforceable and binding provisions on gender right away, because we have sufficient understanding and research showing the nexus between the two.
I would only quickly respond to that to say that simply because we're doing it in other areas doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good model for this, in particular because right now we have very limited data as to the distributional effects of the imposition of sanctions in the labor space. You're totally right. We're doing it left and right in USMCA, and that's groundbreaking. And I think that in another 5-10 years, we'll have the data, right? So in the labor context with USMCA, we'll be able to track that data. We'll have a better understanding, not of what happens to the employers. I mean, good for the employer. In the labor space, we're interested in what happens to the workers. In the gender space, we don't care, we shouldn't care so much about what happened to the employer. We should care about what happened to the women, what happened to the non-binary workers, right? So just because we are, firing off these sanctions and these enforceable provisions in all of these various areas, whether they're sea turtles or vulnerable categories of workers, from an advocacy perspective, I plead for caution and a bit of patience so that we can first gather the necessary data before perhaps inadvertently punishing the very vulnerable categories of citizens that our policies are trying to protect.
Okay, excellent. Desiree and Rita, you mentioned the USMCA, and I would really like to listen to your perspectives on this. So I'd like to start with Desiree. What can you share with us with regards to how gender ended up being addressed in USMCA? And in your opinion, can they serve as a template for other trade agreements?
Thank you, Renata. And for those who have been following the trade space, the answer to how did it arise in USMCA discussions is pretty evident. I mean, Canada, as Georgina has made it very clear, has this as a top priority. So very early on, Canada publicly stated that they were going to pursue a gender chapter. So it was always on the table. But it wasn't just Canada, and I don't think that people should have that perception. US stakeholders, and increasingly, are asking and calling for some form of gender provisions. In fact, there's an entire congressional initiative right now to revise the language of our GSP program to put gender provisions. And while that's not the FTA or trade agreement provisions, it's still an important step for the United States. So these discussions are very much percolating at the Hill, in our own discussions at USTR. Nevertheless, the outcome of USMCA, Canada is pushing for a gender chapter. USMCA did not have a gender chapter. So you can imagine what happened between those blanks. So the United States isn't ready yet, or at least it was not ready during USMCA to provide a gender chapter. Nevertheless, as suggested, USMCA does something, right? So in particular, it provides a new provision that's never been included in other US FTAs with respect to eliminating discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, so SOGI, and caregiving responsibilities. Now, when that provision was first negotiated, rights activists were incredibly excited because finally the United States is recognizing things like gender identity as an important thing to protect. Lest we get too excited, the Trump administration just as quickly dropped a footnote. The important things are always in the footnotes, right? He dropped a footnote saying that the United States was already implementing this commitment by virtue of Title VII. And for those of us in the gender rights space, we know that Title VII has never afforded the right of protection to include gender identity. So the Trump administration was on the one hand including this new wonderful provision, while on the other hand reneging the importance of that provision to the chagrin of the Trump administration. And this involves a way more complicated legal discussion than we have time to deal with. The Supreme Court might have thrown a wrench in the Trump administration's plan through Bostock, but that's a totally irrelevant discussion. To your question of, should US or will USMCA serve as a template for future trade agreements? I hope not, because I think that what we can all agree on is that USMCA didn't really do much for gender rights. And while we all might disagree on whether or not gender provisions should be sanctions-based or economic, and this or that, we all come to this panel and the agreement that trade agreements should do more than what they're doing, and USMCA did not check that box. So I really hope that under the new administration, we continue to push that line and think thoughtfully and deliberately on what type of legal standards to include in trade agreements.
Excellent. Georgina or Amrita, would you like to make any comment on this?
I think Georgina might be more suitable to.
Yeah, sure. I can just mention a few things. I mean, of course, I agree with Desiree. It's not a model for going forward for other trade agreements for Canada or I guess the US. But there are some other things that we did get into the agreement on gender beyond what's in the labor chapter. We do have provisions that are relevant to gender in the investment chapter and the SME chapter. In the investment chapter, we have a definition of corporate social responsibility that affirms the importance of encouraging businesses to respect CSR standards such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And this the CSR provision does provide a definition which includes gender equality and Indigenous peoples' rights. So that is something that we're continuing to pursue in our investment chapter negotiations, but also other provisions that I've already mentioned as well, such as this promoting more women on senior management and board of directors. In the SME chapter, we're also it encourages parties to collaborate on activities that would enhance commercial opportunities for SMEs, including those owned by women, and promote their participation in trade. So those are a few examples, but we also did conduct our gender lens assessment on the final USMCA agreement before it was ratified. Normally we do our gender-based analysis of an agreement as it's being negotiated and sort of in real time modify provisions, to address the findings for risks or opportunities. But in the case of the finalized agreement, USMCA, what we did do was apply our gender lens and look for opportunities to bring a gender lens to the implementation of committee work under the agreement. So this is what we plan to do as the agreement is implemented. In the SME chapter, for example, there's an SME committee and a committee dialogue, and we're bringing gender-oriented work items forward and trying to ensure that there's women business owners are integrated into some of the activities that are being planned. And the other thing that we tried to do by bringing the gender lens to USMCA was be sure that whatever the risks or opportunities were for Canada from this agreement, if there was a risk, that we could address it with a new program or policy to, maybe address job losses, for example. And if there was an opportunity that we can, bring a new policy or program forward to really leverage those opportunities. So this is what our gender lens assessment, brought forward on the final agreement, and we're following up now because we do see that there's potentially good outcomes from that agreement for gender on the implementation side of the agreement.
Excellent. I do have a few more questions to the three of you, but because of time, I'm going to combine the final two questions, and I would like to start with Amrita to answer them. How can gender research and studies play a bigger role in the writing and measurement of trade agreements? And follow-up question, what do you think the future looks like for gender provisions to be included in trade agreements in general?
Thanks for these interesting questions. Let me first answer the second question. I think it's easier to address that first. All the developments we have discussed in the last 1 hour, I guess, go to show that gender mainstreaming or inclusion of gender equality considerations, commitments in trade policy instruments and trade policy agenda context is here to stay. These developments have shown that neither international trade nor gender equality is a zero-sum game. So acknowledging and accepting that gender equality and trade or international trade go hand in hand is quite fundamental. To address your first question here, I think one of the most powerful ways to bring about any change is to build awareness. And there are so many recent studies, reports that have tried to raise awareness among policymakers and negotiators of the economic benefits from women's empowerment in trade and commerce. For example, of course, we would probably be aware of the McKinsey Global Institute report and how it showcased gender equality as a business case, and it argued that, well, gender equality is no longer a moral case, it's actually a business case. It makes market sense because if women play an equal role in labor markets to that of men, gross domestic production will increase by 26% in 2025, and the biggest beneficiaries would be developing countries. There are studies commissioned by OECD, by UN Women, by World Bank, that have taken this business case to altogether another level, a different level. These studies have shown, further clarified the interrelationship and the nexus between gender equality and trade policy instruments. So the next obvious step for scholarship, I guess, is to build understanding on how negotiators can negotiate. and draft gender responsive trade agreements or agreements with a gender lens. What is too gender responsive, or what amounts to being gender blind? This is where we need to have some sort of methodology, some sort of toolkit to see what the metrics are, what the parameters are, and the universally accepted definitions that Georgina and Desiree touched upon are quite fundamental to have as well, to have universal acceptance of this gender lens, so to say. And I was last year working with the International Trade Center. We were trying to somehow design a toolkit that can guide trade negotiators on how they can negotiate and draft gender responsive agreements. So we came up with this new methodology. It's based on maturity model, majority approach, that can help negotiators gauge the gender responsiveness of the agreement's text, but not its implicit provisions or not its implicit implications. And it's in that sense different from the gender impact assessment toolkit of UNCTAD. Now, this ITC toolkit can help policymakers identify the level and the extent of gender responsiveness a particular agreement may have. And it can provide guidance on how they can increase the textual gender responsiveness of these agreements, right? So that is one development. In addition, the UNCTAD's toolkit on gender impact assessment and Canada's GBA plus analysis, for instance, are other useful developments that can help provide benchmarks and metrics as we go about shaping future trade negotiations. But one question that still bothers me, and it would keep itching me if I don't put it out there as a response to what Georgina mentioned a while ago, is, when Canada had made this proposal for the inclusion of a whole standalone chapter on trade and gender in the USMCA text, I wonder if Canada made an effort to carry out either using UNCTAD's toolkit on gender impact assessment or its own GBA plus analysis framework to see what content or what sort of implication has NAFTA had on women over the past 2 decades to try and prepare a better business case for the inclusion of a gender chapter. So I'm not sure if Canada made an attempt in their advocacy to include this new chapter, which indeed got dropped off at the end, and we have USMCA without this chapter. If there was an attempt to use these metrics that had already been developed by then. And basically, to conclude, I would say that we have seen these great strides in scholarship and research on this field more recently, and that is a great news. We need to keep these discussions going to win this battle against gender inequality. I think the momentum is on, and we have to tap into this momentum by carrying on with these discussions.
Rita, thank you very much. I know that Desiree has other commitments at 6. Would you like to offer just your final remarks, Desiree and Georgina?
Speaking of gender issues, I have a small child waiting for his mother. So that's why my remarks are short, and I think we should normalize caregiving. So that is the reason why I have to leave. But thank you all for your remarks. Just one thing, you had asked about the future of trade agreements. And I think, speaking as somebody who, and Georgina will appreciate this, speaking as somebody who's been in the halls of trade, there's so much that revolve around international multilateral policy making, but at the end of the day, our stakeholders and our policymakers are the ones who decide trade policy. And so the one thing that I would urge of the gender advocacy movement more broadly is that arguments become deliberate to the trade policy audience in which they are directing. So for example, an argument that might be persuasive in Canada or in Mexico is not necessarily going to be persuasive in the United States. The United States trade policy makers look for very specific things in deciding what will go into trade agreements. First, it has to be of relevance to American interests, and then second, it has to make sense on a legal platform. So to the extent that the gender rights movement can coalesce on United States relevant discussions, I think that they'll find that they have more success in the United States trade agenda. So with that being said, thank you all for participating in this. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you. Georgina, would you like to make some final remarks?
Sure, thank you. To Desiree and Amrita, it's great to hear such leading experts in this field speak on these issues. I've taken a lot of notes, and I'll see what I can do with them, because I do see the sense of what you're saying, for sure. Of course, Canada is, when we negotiate a trade agreement, we are also wanting to advance the interests of Canadian people. And, obviously that's what all our countries are aiming to do. On the renegotiating of the USMCA, I don't believe that we did apply a gender-based analysis in advance of those negotiations. They were launched very quickly. I wasn't involved in those negotiations myself, and we did launch our GBA process after they were quite well advanced. But we're taking them forward in all of our negotiations now. As I said, they are bearing fruit, and we're finding lots of opportunities to bring a gender provisions into traditional chapters. You wouldn't really expect them, like technical barriers to trade. So you have to just keep working at it and keep an open mind, and be prepared to do a lot of work, but also make mistakes. We didn't use the UNCTAD toolkit because that was very much about the effects of the trade agreement on the other country. As a first step, we got to learn to walk before we can run. So we're looking at the effects in Canada, and we do a lot of stakeholder consultations as well, to inform our approach. But a key issue is the willing negotiating partner. So what? You want to trade in gender chapter, so you want to enforce the bill. Canada's out there. We would want it all, but we don't have the partner on the other side. Like, what can you do? So I think there's huge potential here, and Canada will keep at it, and we've got the messages down for whoever our audience is, and I think over time it will, this recent study out of the WTO and World Bank showed that the more trade there is, the more gender equality there is in countries, and the more gender equality you have in a country, the more trade you get. So, it's win-win all around, and we just have to keep moving forward, and now's the time. So,
thank you so much. I'm really grateful to have you, the three of you here. I'm a big fan of your work. So those of you who are interested in these discussions, please follow these ladies. And thank you so much. I hope we have an opportunity in the future to regroup and debate again. Thank you so much. Thank you, the ITILS, for the opportunity to discuss this important topic. Bye-bye.